In the Prado Museum in Madrid hangs one of the world's most iconic paintings, Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas. At its heart stands a luminous little girl, golden-haired, clad in an ornate gown. Her wide eyes meet ours, full of innocence and curiosity. This is Margarita Teresa of Spain, immortalized in 1656 at just 5 years old. But behind those gentle eyes and royal ribbons hides a haunting truth, a childhood overshadowed by politics, and a short life consumed by duty and dynastic obsession. Margarita Teresa wasn't born to live freely. She was born into the Habsburg dynasty, Europe's most powerful and arguably most self-destructive royal house. A family so fixated on preserving their pure bloodline that they institutionalized incest. Her parents were uncle and niece. Her future husband? Also her uncle. By the time she died at just 21, Margarita had endured 6 pregnancies, multiple miscarriages, and constant physical suffering. Not for love, not for choice, but for a legacy that was already collapsing under the weight of its own inbred design. This isn't a fairy tale of royal courts or elegant ballrooms. It's the chilling story of a girl raised to serve a crumbling empire. A girl whose body and life were treated as currency in a game of dynastic survival. Her brief existence is one of the clearest, most tragic examples in history of how absolute power can twist even the most sacred human relationships, turning family, childhood, and love into tools of manipulation and control. Margarita's story begins in a glittering but suffocating world, 17th century Spanish royalty, a realm where children were assets, not individuals. From the moment she drew her first breath on July 12, 1651, in Madrid's Grand Royal Alcazar, Margarita Teresa didn't belong to herself. She belonged to the empire. The Spanish Empire was already showing signs of decay. The same bloodline obsession that had once powered Habsburg dominance was now corroding it from within. Margarita would become both symbol and casualty of that decline. A beautiful child destined to serve as a living sacrifice to preserve an illusion of strength. Velázquez's painting doesn't just capture technical mastery. It freezes in time the last flicker of Habsburg Spain's former glory. That curious little girl in the canvas? She didn't yet know she'd be shipped across Europe to marry her uncle, endure pregnancy after pregnancy, and die before she'd ever get a chance to truly live. To understand Margarita's fate, we have to understand the monstrous machine that shaped it, the Habsburg dynasty. For centuries, this family ruled vast territories across Europe through clever, calculated marriages. But what started as political strategy soon spiraled into something much darker, a fanatical commitment to keeping royal blood pure through systematic incest. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. The Habsburg family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a tangled, knotted vine that twisted back on itself generation after generation. By the 1600s, the genetic consequences were impossible to ignore. Children were increasingly born with deformities, disabilities, and illnesses. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw caused by inbreeding, became so exaggerated that some royals couldn't chew or speak clearly. And yet, the dynasty pushed forward, convinced that keeping the bloodline clean was worth any price, even if it meant creating generations of rulers barely capable of ruling. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs, Margarita's side of the family, was particularly extreme. Her father, King Philip IV, was already the result of multiple incestuous unions. Her mother, Mariana of Austria, was Philip's own niece, his sister's daughter. That made Margarita Teresa the concentrated product of centuries of Habsburg DNA. a genetic cocktail with all the built-in danger signs flashing red. And people knew it. Court physicians and advisors weren't blind to the health consequences of this inbreeding. But they didn't dare challenge royal tradition. Instead, they invented elaborate justifications for why foreign marriages were a threat, why only pure Habsburgs could continue the divine right to rule. These arguments had nothing to do with science and everything to do with fear, superstition, and a deeply ingrained arrogance that said Habsburg blood was sacred, no matter how broken it made the people who carried it. And yet, ironically, by the time Margarita was born, other European monarchies were beginning to change course. The French Bourbons and the English Stuarts were starting to prioritize strategic marriages outside their inner circle, seeking alliances through less risky unions with distant nobility. They saw the writing on the wall. But the Habsburgs, stubborn and self-assured, refused to budge. They doubled down. And Margarita Teresa, a baby girl celebrated not for who she was, but for what she could offer, was immediately swept into that ancient, unyielding tide. When Margarita was born, her father was 51 years old, an aging monarch presiding over a crumbling empire. Spain was spiraling, military defeats abroad, economic collapse at home, and political instability everywhere. Philip IV saw his newborn daughter not as a child, but as a diplomatic pawn, a potential lifeline, someone who could be exchanged for power. Her mother, Mariana, was just 22, but she knew exactly what lay ahead. She had herself been shipped off from Austria to Spain at 14, married to her uncle to strengthen royal ties. Now she watched her daughter being groomed for the same fate, powerless to change a system that viewed their very existence as tools for empire. Before Margarita could even walk, the palace was already calculating her marriage prospects. They studied family trees, weighed alliances, and speculated on dowries. Her future husband would almost certainly be Austrian, likely a Habsburg, likely her uncle. Despite the heavy burden of expectation, records suggest that Margarita was bright and curious. She picked up languages with ease, loved music and art, and displayed a charm that delighted the court. These qualities, rather than granting her freedom, only made her more marketable. A beautiful, clever princess would fetch a better alliance than a dull or defiant one. Artists like Velázquez immortalized her in portraits that showed not just her famous golden curls and pale Habsburg complexion, but also a spark in her eyes, a vitality, a brief, fleeting sense of self before the empire swallowed her whole. But behind the grandeur of royal life was a system designed to strip children like Margarita of their agency. She wasn't allowed to play with other children. She couldn't express personal preferences. Her education focused not on broadening her mind, but preparing her for one purpose: marriage. And not just any marriage, but the kind of Habsburg union that kept the bloodline dangerously tight. Her curriculum was tailored to that end. She learned Latin and German, not for personal growth, but because she was expected to move to the Austrian court. She studied the rituals of Catholic devotion favored by her future in-laws. She was taught to walk, talk, and carry herself with poise, not for her own sake, but to appeal to whichever man she'd be traded to. Even her body was scrutinized with clinical detachment. Palace doctors began monitoring her physical development when she was just 10. Their reports, preserved in archives, discuss her as though she were livestock, evaluating her fertility, estimating her reproductive potential, and noting milestones that would determine when she could start producing heirs. By the time she turned 11, negotiations had already begun. The preferred groom, her mother's brother, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. Her uncle, Leopold I, head of the Austrian Habsburgs, was 23 years old when the Spanish court began negotiating his marriage to 11-year-old Margarita Teresa. He was also her maternal uncle, her mother's younger brother, making the proposed union yet another turn of the twisted spiral of Habsburg inbreeding. To both courts, however, the match was perfect, politically advantageous, symbolically potent, and, perhaps most importantly, genetically pure. For the Spanish, this marriage was more than just a dynastic arrangement. It was a last-ditch effort to keep power consolidated between the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg branches. Margarita's only surviving brother, Prince Felipe Prospero, was frail and sickly, unlikely to live long enough to inherit the throne. With the male line faltering, Margarita became the Spanish crown's best hope. Her womb, quite literally, became their battlefield. Leopold, for his part, wasn't new to these arrangements. He had already been married once, also to his niece. Though that marriage had ended in tragedy when his young bride died childless. Now, the Austrian court saw Margarita Teresa as a replacement, a second chance, another young girl to continue the genetic legacy, no matter how warped it had become. Negotiations between the two courts dragged on for months. They didn't just discuss love or compatibility. Those ideas were laughably irrelevant. Instead, they argued over dowries, territorial claims, succession rights, and the number of ships that would accompany Margarita on her journey. These were not marriage talks. They were political transactions. Spanish officials emphasized Margarita's charm, intelligence, and most importantly, her health and fertility. Austrian envoys demanded detailed medical reports, assessing whether she could survive childbirth and produce male heirs. They combed through every inch of her young life, evaluating whether this 12-year-old girl would be physically capable of upholding an empire. No one asked Margarita what she wanted. No one even thought to. Palace doctors submitted regular reports on her physical development, written in cold, clinical language. They predicted when she'd start menstruating, how long her reproductive window might last, and how many children she could reasonably be expected to bear. Astrologers were consulted to select the most favorable dates for the wedding and first consummation. Religious leaders issued declarations affirming the divine necessity of the union, praising it as God's will, even though it directly violated Catholic laws against close-kin marriage. Exceptions, it seemed, were easily made for royalty. By early 1663, when Margarita Teresa was only 12, the marriage contract was finalized. It was agreed that the wedding would officially take place once she turned 14, the age at which the Habsburgs deemed a girl ready for marriage and for pregnancy. In those final 2 years in Spain, Margarita's life changed again. Her education intensified, not to make her wise or curious, but to mold her into a perfect Austrian empress. She was taught the customs of the Viennese court, drilled in its etiquette, its fashion, its prayers. She studied the complex family tree of her future husband, learning the names of his relatives, their alliances, their expectations. Most of all, she was trained to accept her duty, producing sons, maintaining alliances, sacrificing self. When the time came, the wedding was conducted by proxy in Madrid. On April the 25th, 1666, at the age of 14, Margarita Teresa stood in a cathedral wearing an elaborate gown that shimmered like a relic. The Austrian ambassador stood in for Leopold during the ceremony. Margarita recited her vows, not to a man she knew, but to an empire she could never escape. Witnesses describe her as pale, solemn, and silent. No joy, no excitement. Just a child completing a script that had been written for her before she could even speak. Almost immediately, she was prepared for her journey from Madrid to Vienna. The path would take her through multiple countries, with stops in various royal courts, each eager to witness the living embodiment of the Spanish-Austrian alliance. Her entourage was massive: dozens of carriages, soldiers, servants, ladies-in-waiting, and nobles. It was a parade, a spectacle, a delivery. And everywhere she went, crowds gathered to see her, the golden-haired princess, now a teenage bride, en route to her destiny. She was admired like a jewel, discussed like a commodity, and smiled at like a painting come to life. But those who looked closer noticed something else. Foreign diplomats who met her along the way wrote of her quiet demeanor, her intelligence, her beauty. But they also noted her sadness. Her eyes, they said, were distant. Her manner, strained. She was courteous, yes, but there was fear underneath the poise. She had been trained for this, but that didn't make it easier. On December 5th, 1666, Margarita Teresa finally arrived in Vienna. Her reception was grand. Fireworks, feasts, processions, religious ceremonies. The Austrian court wanted the world to see this as a triumph. The union of two great houses, a new empress arriving to continue the Habsburg legacy. But under all the pageantry was the simple truth. A terrified 15-year-old girl had been shipped across Europe to marry a man twice her age, who was also her uncle. The official wedding took place on December 12th, in Vienna's St. Stephen's Cathedral. Witnesses again described the bride's gown as stunning, heavy with gold thread, embroidered with Habsburg symbols, but the bride herself looked overwhelmed. Leopold, now 26, was described as gentle but reserved. A product of the same system, he had little choice in the matter either. And so, without love, without freedom, without even a shared childhood, the two were joined. A girl and a man, a niece and her uncle, a pawn and a king. Margarita Teresa's new life as empress began immediately, and so did the pressure to conceive. There was no adjustment period, no pause to let her recover from the long journey or the emotional upheaval. She had a job now, to produce children, and soon. Leopold was, by the standards of his day, not unkind. He treated Margarita with formal politeness. He showed her respect, and some letters suggest he even grew fond of her. But affection wasn't enough. This was a Habsburg marriage. Affection could not override the cold arithmetic of inheritance, succession, and empire. Margarita was placed under strict supervision. Her diet, sleep, movements, and social interactions were all regulated by the court. Older women, many of them former brides turned mothers-in-law or widows, were assigned to guide her, watch her, and report on her progress. These women had once been in her place, and now enforced the same standards on her. Every month, court physicians examined her to track her menstrual cycle and estimate her fertility window. Their reports, again, spoke of her body as though it were a royal machine. Charts, timelines, and predictions. No mention of her feelings. No concern for her mental state. By early 1667, less than 3 months after her arrival in Vienna, the court celebrated its first triumph. Margarita Teresa was pregnant. She was just 15 years old. The news of Margarita Teresa's pregnancy was met with ecstatic celebration in Vienna. Trumpets sounded, bells rang, and the court erupted in public joy. For the Habsburgs, this meant the alliance was bearing fruit, literally. But behind the pageantry was a teenager terrified of what lay ahead. Margarita had barely begun to adjust to life in a foreign land. She was surrounded by unfamiliar customs, a different language, and a court culture steeped in surveillance and duty. Now, at 15, she was expected to endure the physical and emotional toll of childbirth. Not just once, but repeatedly, until she produced the necessary heirs, especially a son. The pregnancy was hard on her. Court documents from the time describe her as increasingly anxious, withdrawn, and exhausted. She suffered from intense morning sickness and struggled to keep up with the court's rigorous schedule. Her body, still in the midst of its own natural development, was forced into the demands of motherhood far too soon. Still, she delivered. In August 1667, at the age of 16, Margarita gave birth to a baby girl, Maria Antonia. The Austrian court had hoped for a boy, of course, but the child was healthy, and for the moment, that was enough. But even in her joy, Margarita knew the clock had restarted. Another pregnancy would be expected soon. There was no time to recover. The pressure to produce a male heir weighed heavily on her, imposed by an empire that treated her not as a person, but as a vessel. Her days followed a strict, draining routine. She was expected to maintain her appearance at court events, show unwavering piety, and embody the grace of a Habsburg empress, even while her health steadily declined. As she went through multiple pregnancies and miscarriages in the following years, her condition visibly worsened. The court physicians continued to monitor her obsessively, keeping detailed records of her fertility, but ignoring her increasing fragility. She was plagued by severe headaches, fatigue, and frequent fevers. The toll of pregnancy after pregnancy and the heartbreak of miscarriages was devastating. Still, no one in power considered stepping back. The dynasty came first. Margarita's husband, Leopold, appeared to care for her in his own way. He was never cruel and often expressed concern for her well-being. But he too was a prisoner of dynastic necessity. The idea of spacing out pregnancies or prioritizing her recovery would have been unthinkable. Producing heirs was not just a personal duty, it was the duty of the crown. Between 1667 and 1673, Margarita Teresa experienced 6 pregnancies. Of these, only one child survived infancy, her daughter, Maria Antonia. The others ended in miscarriages or infant deaths, tragedies that were seen less as personal losses and more as political failures. Each loss pushed Margarita closer to physical collapse. As her health continued to deteriorate, the court clung to its rituals. They fed her tonics, imposed even stricter dietary regimens, and ordered more prayers and religious services on her behalf. But the essential truth was unavoidable. She was dying. Her body was breaking down under the relentless pressure of childbearing and court expectations. And yet, she still had to perform. Despite being weak and frequently bedridden, Margarita was expected to appear at formal functions and maintain a serene, queenly demeanor. The court's demands didn't soften. The empire still needed heirs. Her usefulness had not yet expired. Her mother, Mariana, still in Spain, followed her daughter's decline from afar with growing dread. Letters between the two suggest deep emotional distress. Mariana, who had once made the same journey from Austria to Spain, knew exactly what her daughter was going through, but could do nothing to stop it. She had handed her child over to the same machine that had once consumed her. By 1673, Margarita's condition had become critical. Court doctors began reporting alarming symptoms: extreme weakness, severe internal pain, and a persistent cough that hinted at tuberculosis. She could barely walk. She was just 21. On March 12, 1673, Empress Margarita Teresa died in Vienna. Her death sent shockwaves through the Austrian and Spanish courts, but not for the reasons one might expect. The political consequences of her death dominated the conversation. What it meant for succession, how it might affect alliances, whether her daughter could serve as a future bargaining tool. Very few seemed to dwell on the human tragedy, the short life of a girl who had given everything and died with nothing of her own. Margarita Teresa was buried in the imperial crypt in Vienna, surrounded by marble and gold. Her funeral was grand, solemn, and filled with ritual. But no amount of ceremony could erase the truth. She had been a sacrifice, a girl born into luxury, destined for suffering, a human offering to keep a dying empire afloat.